This map tells us the linguistic roots of certain place names in what is today northern England and southern Scotland. The red dots indicate places with Saxon or English roots, but the green dots show places that have Brittonic or Celtic roots. These types of names are more common in western parts of Scotland, Ireland and Wales, but are definitely not common east of the Pennine Mountains that divide England. But this map doesn't just show us a linguistic trend, it is something much more. It is some of the last surviving evidence for the existence of a shadowy medieval kingdom which once is said to have existed here. That kingdom was called Goddodin, and around the turn of the 7th century it disappears completely from the historical record. This map is one of the few pieces of evidence to suggest it ever existed. Today, join me as we search back into the depths of time to discover the truth about this lost kingdom, and find out just what happened to the Kingdom of Goddodin. To do so, we will need to travel back in time to the Hen Ogledd, or the north of England that is. The Hen Ogledd refers to the period in the history of northern Britain from the departure of the Romans to the Saxon conquests. It is a period shrouded in mystery. We have practically no written records describing it or telling us its history. What we do know comes mostly from ancient Welsh texts. Many Welsh kings trace their descent back to rulers from the north, and a few fragments of information tell us about the land and its people and history. One of these kingdoms was the mighty land of Goddodin. Said to exist in what is today southern Scotland and Northumberland, the kingdom had its capital in Edinburgh. The kingdom is said to have been home to many mighty warriors, including the famous Welshman who travelled from Goddodin to North Wales, where he founded the Kingdom of Gwynedd. However, around the turn of the 7th century, Goddodin suffered a steep and sudden decline, practically disappearing from the history books. When it comes to why Goddodin disappeared, our sole source of information is the Brittonic poem Y Goddodin, which is one of the oldest surviving post-Roman poetry in Europe, with the oldest version being dated to the 7th century. The poem tells us of the king of Goddodin known as Manyfog, who leads a group of 300 warriors to fight against an enemy. I say an enemy because it isn't clear exactly who this enemy was. The poem survives in 3 forms, 1, 2 and 3. They have slight differences, but these differences can change our view of what happened to Goddodin massively. What they are generally clear about is that around the year 600, the king of Goddodin led a group of warriors to fight and suffered either a massive defeat or a draw that resulted in huge devastation and essentially the end of the kingdom. But when it comes to figuring out how this defeat occurred, who they were fighting or where it even took place, historians are divided. First, let us start with the easiest question to answer: where did the battle take place? Well, the poem records the location as Catraeth, but there is no such place with that name today. In the 19th century, a man by the name of E.W.B. Nicholson believed that the battle took place near the Scottish region of Raith, which is in Fife. Yay, Fife again. But this conclusion seemingly stems from the fact that Raith seems similar to the original Brittonic name, Catraeth. However, this location seems to be completely at odds with what the poem is talking about: a battle against Saxons and potentially fellow Britons, most definitely not against Picts. Why would the Saxons land in Fife? Most modern historians place the location at modern Catterick, a town in Yorkshire. Catterick was a notable Roman fort and developed into a not insignificant regional centre, so a battle for control of it doesn't seem strange. Now, to the bigger question, just who were the Goddodin warriors fighting? Who destroyed the kingdom? Well, here's where things get juicy. First, let's start with the easiest version: that the kingdom, like most other Brittonic kingdoms in England, was destroyed by the advancing Saxons. Indeed, it would be the Saxon kingdom of Bernicia, and later Northumbria, that would in future control the lands that were once part of Goddodin. To continue the story, we will first need to familiarise ourselves with the lay of the land at the time. The Saxons were coming over from Germany and settling in the east of England, with islands such as Lindisfarne being outposts and fortresses for them. Meanwhile, more inland and to the west, there was still a patchwork of independent British kings. Chief amongst them was King Urien of Reged, who controlled much of the land to the west of the Pennine Mountains, and according to another ancient Welsh text, it is said he controlled Catterick too. Around the year 570, he apparently led a coalition to drive the Saxons out. They apparently cornered the Saxon king Theodoric in Lindisfarne, but before they could take the island, Reged was treacherously slain by one of his friends, who was jealous of him. After that, it is implied the Saxons regained their lands, and that by the turn of the 7th century, which is the date the poem gives for the battle, they were yet again an existential threat to Goddodin, who were forced to lead a desperate counterattack to try and save themselves. The evidence for this is simple. The poem says their opponents were Loegir, a Brittonic term for Englishmen. So is that the end of the debate? Well, no. The key problem with this interpretation is the date the poem records for the battle, 600 AD. Archaeological excavations in Catterick have shown Saxon brooches and buildings to have been present there since at least the year 500. Suggesting the town had been Saxon for 100 years or more by the time the battle supposedly took place. Furthermore, by the time the battle is supposed to have taken place, the war against the Saxons had basically been lost. Indeed, by the turn of the 7th century, the Saxons were within 50 miles of Edinburgh, the stronghold of Goddodin. Surely Moneyfog would have had far more pressing concerns than the control of Catterick. Why would he send 300 men of Goddodin deep into enemy territory to attack a random Yorkshire town that had been Saxon for generations? Now, I don't know what sort of 5D chess Moneyfog is playing, but it seems very strange. What does this suggest then? Well, that the battle cannot have taken place as late as they said it did, if their enemies truly were Saxons. Historian John Cock instead suggests the battle took place earlier. Indeed, he believes the later battle against the Saxons was actually referring to an earlier battle that took place in the same area. But this time the Goddodin weren't fighting Saxons, he says, but their fellow Britons. Specifically, Urien Reged. Whilst E. Goddodin is the sole text to describe a 7th century battle against Loegir, several other Brittonic sources do describe a battle at Catterick, but this one took place around the year 570. But here, the Goddodin are depicted as the aggressors, who invaded the land of their fellow Britons, particularly Urien. According to this theory, Urien the Briton had built massive power in the north of England, and it was him, not the Saxons, that threatened the power of Goddodin. It was him that Moneyfog attacked, and it was at the hand of their fellow Britons that Moneyfog was defeated. This theory is mainly based upon the dating issue described above, an examination of other ancient sources. E. Goddodin is the sole text to describe a 7th century battle, but several other texts describe a battle between Urien and invaders from the north. Cock interprets this as being the Goddodin. Indeed, the E. Goddodin itself describes the battle's victors as being the sons of Godeboch, who was the ancestor of Urien Reged. So is that the end of the story? Well, we have to deal with the fact that the Loegir are clearly listed as the defenders of Catterick in 2 of the poem's versions. How do we account for this? Well, Cock suggests a middle ground. Seeing as we know that Catterick had been Saxon since 500, and that Urien controlled it in 570, it must mean that the Saxons there were fighting under or with the Britons. I know we like to imagine the Saxon conquests as a clear narrative of Britain versus Saxon, but in reality E. Goddodin could show us that for many years Saxons and Britons fought together against other Britons and potentially even against Saxons, and that the downfall of Goddodin could partially be laid to rest at the feet of their fellow Britons.